SOA, the Infernal One. Perhaps the most intriguing and enigmatic aspect of the Operation storyline in Star Wars: The Old Republic is that of our first true boss, SOA. SOA is unique, both as a Rakatan and an endgame boss. He was, of course, the last boss of the Eternity Vault, but more importantly, he was the last of what I consider to be the great Rakatans from the prehistory of the Old Republic. But now you may be asking, what about the Rakatans, and why do we care? Well, now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The Rakatans were not just some backwards tribe on a backwards planet, with a couple of soldiers throwing spears and rocks at each other. No, the Rakatans and their infinite empire were advanced. And I do not mean advanced for their time. I simply mean advanced as in equal in nearly every respect, and far greater in innumerable others than either the Sith or the Republic are in SWTOR, and by extension the galactic empire of the original trilogy. The Rakatans were, and are, the creators of some of the most awesome weaponry in the entire Star Wars universe. As an example, the Rakatans controlled a relatively small empire of 500 habited planets, yet they had an army of over 10 billion Rakatan Force-sensitive warriors. That's 10 billion with a B. And just for a sense of scale, the so-called Grand Army of the Republic numbered in the low millions during the Clone Wars, and those were non-Force-sensitive clones with blaster-type weaponry, and armor incapable of stopping even a blaster bolt. Rakatans, on the other hand, bore Force sabers and personal shielding powered by the dark side, as well as sentient droids driven by a unique fusion of machine and Force energies. We encountered one of these droids in Knights of the Old Republic. They were uniquely capable of repairing any damage caused to themselves. The Infinite Empire was truly a force to be feared. And this brings us back to SOA. He was, of course, Rakatan. However, he rebelled against the Infinite Empire. His fledgling empire apparently sprang into being millennia before the collapse of the Rakatan Empire, and had control of 1,000 worlds, including his jewel of Korriban, homeworld of the Sith. This represented his glorious apotheosis, and the start of his inevitable decline. But this also represents the point at which the timeline becomes muddied and difficult to understand. And here's why. SOA's capital was on Korriban. Now this may seem unimportant, but Korriban was discovered about 27,700 years before the Battle of Yavin 4. The Sith species under King Adas soon rebelled against the Rakatans and drove them off. Now we know that SOA was only imprisoned well after the Rakatans were initially driven off Korriban. But when was the rule of SOA? Was it before or after the rebellion of Adas? Now this is never confirmed explicitly in any form of Star Wars content. However, I think the answer is after, solely because one of the members of SOA's Infernal Council was named Yashar Khael, and subtitled The Betrayer of Adas, implying that his betrayal of Adas got him in good graces with the Infernal One. And this likely means that SOA was already hundreds, if not thousands of years old by the time of his capture, as Adas was hundreds of years old himself, 800, I believe. This is an important fact when we consider that the time period of SOA's imprisonment makes no sense. Just as explanation, the Rakatan Empire fell over 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin 4. SWTOR itself takes place roughly 3,600 years before the Battle of Yavin 4, and among SOA's many prideful boasts, his most famous is perhaps that he has been imprisoned for 20,000 years. Now this would imply that he was imprisoned 2,000 years after the fall of the Rakatan Empire. Additionally, the Rakatan Empire was too weak and fractured during the last few centuries nearest 25,200 to challenge a Rakatan warlord of SOA's power, who controlled twice the number of worlds as the entire Infinite Empire itself. The last point in time that makes sense in the narrative would have been around 25,700, around the height of the Rakatan Infinite Empire's strength, and this would still be well over 20,000 years. But perhaps SOA wasn't quite as up-to-date on galactic time, you ask. Well, how caught up do you think he was on cartography? I already pointed out that his personal holdings included 1,000 worlds. The entire Infinite Empire only had 500 worlds at its zenith, at around 25,700. And this is a truly strange lore lapse. The Rakatan hyperdrive technology was never the same as the Grease. It needed the dark side of the Force to function. So to have twice the number of worlds under his command, SOA would first have needed to find 1,000 new worlds to conquer. Heck, even if he conquered the entire Infinite Empire, he would still have to discover and conquer that many worlds again. So we can either decide that BioWare simply cannot write a coherent story, and discard all of these discrepancies. After all, why does it matter? SOA is dead. But that isn't how BioWare works. The main villains for much of the first game were the Dread Masters, a seemingly minor tangent from the second operation, Karaga's Palace, became the primary villains for years after. Because of this, I think that instead we must consider the alternative, that BioWare has written the most blaringly obvious lead-up to an eventual returning foe, SOA, and a resurgent Infinite Empire. Now this is certainly a bold claim, and bold claims demand citable evidence. Fortunately, SOA wasn't exactly one to hold his cards close, and I think he directly told us of his return, unlike all of his other statements, which he seems to have made as boasts of the past. His last statement was more of a personal note to self, said for his benefit alone. And I quote, "They slay, not knowing that I am the seed of destruction in their hearts. I am the master and creator, what the galaxy fears." Now this may sound like less of a boast and more of a warning, and I think that might be right. And that makes me wonder, if he's actually giving us an ironic warning, could that mean that he's still alive? After all, the Rakatans must have had some reason for imprisoning him rather than destroying him with their vast resources. An army was personally necessary just to restrain SOA. It's likely that they wanted to imprison him rather than kill him for some reason, or that they were incapable of killing him. This only leads to the question of why they left him in his gigantic and ridiculous body. The signature Rakatan prison was a mind trap, capable of stripping the consciousness out of a person and rendering their body harmless. What did the ancient Rakatans fear so much that they kept him in stasis for tens of thousands of years? Don't forget, these same Rakatans easily defeated the Qua and the immortal Celestials. If they so feared SOA, there must be a rational reason, and I think it's because he was truly the master. Perhaps just of his personal empire, but I think it's more likely that he was the master of all Rakatans. I think that SOA was an overpredator. But so what? An overpredator? How can the galaxy fear him still if no one living had even heard of him? And what did SOA create that was so awesome? The Starforge? Destroyed. The Foundry? Destroyed. What else is there? I'll say it again. I do not think that any of SOA's boasts were baseless. I think that we have a legitimate reason to suspect that the galaxy has something to fear from him. And I think that by killing him, or at least killing the gigantic version of him we encountered, we have unleashed his true power. The most intriguing aspect of his last sentence was the bit mentioning us, the player. We killed him, ignorant of the fact that SOA was the seed of destruction in our hearts. Now, I took this sentence to mean, after slaying SOA, he will become the seed of destruction. But that's not what he says. In fact, he is stating that he is the seed of destruction in the heroes' hearts. But he is not the seed of destruction of their hearts. He isn't warning them personally, but the galaxy as a whole. In other words, he is a seed of destruction that simply happens to be in the hearts of those who slay him, almost as though he's saying pieces of him were transmitted to the people who struck him down, the same people who later leave Belsavis. Might we have inadvertently offered this 50-foot Rakatan away off of the planet? But who can say what he is? His body was larger than any other Rakatan, perhaps the product of dark-side alchemy, or even the will of his power made manifest. He likely was not any sort of mortal being, but some sort of cosmic horror, so dissimilar to what he was, as Vitiate is dissimilar to a Sith. Now this sounds like a rehashing of the Emperor's story, and in many ways it is. However, I think that if SOA does return to the game, he will desire conquest rather than destruction. And with the tools and powers of the Rakatans, combined with the hyperspace technology of contemporary SWTOR, he may prove to establish a true infinite empire, one that dwarfs the original. Certainly, a reason for the galaxy to fear.